Chapter 25 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 25. But, mother, now a shade has passed athwart my brightest visions here, a cloud of darkest gloom has wrapped the remnant of my brief career. No song, no echo can I win, the sparkling fount has died within. Margaret Davidson, To My Mother, 11, 7-12. Hist and Hetty arose with the return of light, leaving Judith still buried in sleep. It took but a minute for the first to complete her toilet. Her long coal-black hair was soon adjusted in a simple knot, the calico dress belted tight to her slender waist, and her little feet concealed in their gaudily ornamented moccasins. When attired, she left her companion employed in household affairs, and went herself on the platform to breathe the pure air of the morning. Here she found Chingachgook studying the shores of the lake, the mountains, and the heavens, with the sagacity of a man of the woods, and the gravity of an Indian. The meeting between the two lovers was simple, but affectionate. The chief showed a manly kindness, equally removed from boyish weakness and haste, while the girl betrayed in her smile and half-averted looks the bashful tenderness of her sex. Neither spoke, unless it were with the eyes, though each understood the other as fully as if a vocabulary of words and protestations had been poured out. Hist seldom appeared to more advantage than at that moment, for just from her rest and ablutions there was a freshness about her youthful form and face that the toils of the wood do not always permit to be exhibited, by even the juvenile and pretty. Then Judith had not only imparted some of her own skill in the toilet, during their short intercourse, but she had actually bestowed a few well-selected ornaments from her own stores, that contributed not a little to set off the natural graces of the Indian maid. All this the lover saw and felt, and for a moment his countenance was illuminated with a look of pleasure, but it soon grew grave again, and became saddened and anxious. The stools used the previous night were still standing on the platform. Placing two against the walls of the hut, he seated himself on one, making a gesture to his companion to take the other. This done, he continued thoughtful and silent for quite a minute, maintaining the reflecting dignity of one born to take his seat at the council fire, while Hist was furtively watching the expression of his face, patient and submissive, as became a woman of her people. Then the young warrior stretched his arm before him, as if to point out the glories of the scene at that witching hour, when the whole panorama, as usual, was adorned by the mellow distinctness of early morning, sweeping with his hand slowly over the lake, hills, and heavens. The girl followed the movement with pleased wonder, smiling as each new beauty met her gaze. "Hugh!" exclaimed the chief, in admiration of a scene so unusual even to him, for this was the first lake he had ever beheld. "This is the country of the Manitou. It is too good for Mingoes, Hist. But the curs of that tribe are howling in packs through the woods. They think that the Delawares are asleep, over the mountains." "All but one of them is, Chingachgook. There is one here, and he is of the blood of Uncas." "What is one warrior against a tribe? The path to our villages is very long and crooked, and we shall travel it under a cloudy sky. I am afraid, too, Honeysuckle of the Hills, that we shall travel it alone." Hist understood the allusion, and it made her sad, though it sounded sweet to her ears to be compared by the warrior she so loved, to the most fragrant and the pleasantest of all the wild flowers of her native woods. Still she continued silent, as became her when the allusion was to a grave interest that men could best control, though it exceeded the power of education to conceal the smile that gratified feeling brought to her pretty mouth. "When the sun is thus," continued the Delaware, pointing to the zenith, by simply casting upward a hand and finger, by a play of the wrist, "the great hunter of our tribe will go back to the Hurons to be treated like a bear, that they roast and skin even on full stomachs." "The Great Spirit may soften their hearts, and not suffer them to be so bloody minded. I have lived among the Hurons, and know them. They have hearts, and will not forget their own children, should they fall into the hands of the Delawares." "A wolf is forever howling. A hog will always eat. They have lost warriors. Even their women will call out for vengeance. The pale face has the eyes of an eagle, and can see into a Mingo's heart. He looks for no mercy. There is a cloud over his spirit, though it is not before his face." A long, thoughtful pause succeeded, during which Hist stealthily took the hand of the chief, as if seeking his support, though she scarce ventured to raise her eyes to a countenance that was now literally becoming terrible, under the conflicting passions and stern resolution that were struggling in the breast of its owner. "What will the son of Uncas do?" the girl at length timidly asked. "He is a chief, and is already celebrated in council, though so young. What does his heart tell him is wisest? Does the head, too, speak the same words as the heart?" "What does Wah ta Wah say, at a moment when my dearest friend is in such danger? The smallest birds sing the sweetest. It is always pleasant to hearken to their songs. I wish I could hear the wren of the woods in my difficulty. Its note would reach deeper than the ear." Again Hist experienced the profound gratification that the language of praise can always awaken, when uttered by those we love. The honeysuckle of the hills was a term often applied to the girl by the young men of the Delawares, though it never sounded so sweet in her ears as from the lips of Chingachgook. But the latter alone had ever styled her the wren of the woods. With him, however, it had got to be a familiar phrase, and it was past expression pleasant to the listener, since it conveyed to her mind the idea that her advice and sentiments were as acceptable to her future husband, as the tones of her voice and modes of conveying them were agreeable. Uniting the two things most prized by an Indian girl, as coming from her betrothed, admiration for a valued physical advantage, with respect for her opinion, she pressed the hand she held between both her own, and answered: "Wah ta Wah says that neither she nor the Great Serpent could ever laugh again, or ever sleep without dreaming of the Hurons, should the Deerslayer die under a Mingo tomahawk, and they do nothing to save him. She would rather go back, and start on her long path alone, than let such a dark cloud pass before her happiness." "Good. The husband and the wife will have but one heart. They will see with the same eyes, and feel with the same feelings." What further was said need not be related here. That the conversation was of Deerslayer and his hopes has been seen already, but the decision that was come to will better appear in the course of the narrative. The youthful pair were yet conversing when the sun appeared above the tops of the pines, and the light of a brilliant American day streamed down into the valley, bathing in deep joy the lake, the forests, and the mountain sides. Just at this instant Deerslayer came out of the cabin of the Ark, and stepped upon the platform. His first look was at the cloudless heavens, then his rapid glance took in the entire panorama of land and water, when he had leisure for a friendly nod at his friends, and a cheerful smile for Hist. "Well," he said in his usual composed manner and pleasant voice, "he that sees the sun set in the west, and wakes arly enough in the morning, will be sartain to find him coming back ag'in in the east, like a buck that is hunted round his ha'nt. I dare say, now, Hist, you've beheld this, time and ag'in, and yet it never entered into your galish mind to ask the reason?" Both Chingachgook and his betrothed looked up at the luminary, with an air that betokened sudden wonder, and then they gazed at each other, as if to seek the solution of the difficulty. Familiarity deadens the sensibilities even as connected with the gravest natural phenomena, and never before had these simple beings thought of inquiring into a movement that was of daily occurrence, however puzzling it might appear on investigation. When the subject was thus suddenly started, it struck both alike, and at the same instant, with some such force as any new and brilliant proposition in the natural sciences would strike the scholar. Chingachgook alone saw fit to answer. "The pale faces know everything," he said. "Can they tell us why the sun hides his face, when he goes back, at night?" "Ay, that is downright red skin l'arnin'," returned the other, laughing, though he was not altogether insensible to the pleasure of proving the superiority of his race by solving the difficulty, which he set about doing in his own peculiar manner. "Harkee, Sarpent," he continued more gravely, though too simply for affectation, "this is easierly explained than an Indian brain may fancy. The sun, while he seems to keep travelling in the heavens, never budges, but it is the 'arth that turns round, and any one can understand, if he is placed on the side of a mill wheel, for instance, when it's in motion, that he must sometimes see the heavens, while he is at other times under water. There's no great secret in that, but plain natur', the difficulty being in setting the 'arth in motion." "How does my brother know that the earth turns round?" demanded the Indian. "Can he see it?" "Well, that's been a puzzler, I will own, Delaware, for I've often tried, but never could fairly make it out. Sometimes I've consaited that I could, and then again I've been obliged to own it an onpossibility. Howsever, turn it does, as all my people say, and you ought to believe 'em, since they can foretell eclipses and other prodigies that used to fill the tribes with terror, according to your own traditions of such things." "Good! This is true. No red man will deny it. When a wheel turns, my eyes can see it. They do not see the earth turn." "Ay, that's what I call sense obstinacy. Seeing is believing, they say, and what they can't see, some men won't in the least give credit to. Nevertheless, chief, that isn't quite as good reason as it may at first seem. You believe in the Great Spirit, I know, and yet, I conclude, it would puzzle you to show where you see him." "Chingachgook can see him everywhere in good things, the evil spirit in bad. Here in the lake, there in the forest, yonder in the clouds, in Hist, in the son of Uncas, in Tannemund, in Deerslayer. The evil spirit is in the Mingos, that I see. I do not see the earth turn round." "I don't wonder they call you the Sarpent, Delaware. No, I don't. There's always a meaning in your words, and there's often a meaning in your countenance, too. Notwithstanding, your answers doesn't quite meet my idee. That God is observable in all natural objects is allowable, but then he is not perceptible in the way I mean. You know there is a Great Spirit by his works, and the pale faces know that the 'arth turns round by its works. This is the reason of the matter, though how it is to be explained is more than I can exactly tell you. This I know, all my people consait that fact, and what all the pale faces consait is very likely to be true." "When the sun is in the top of that pine to-morrow, where will my brother Deerslayer be?" The hunter started, and he looked intently, though totally without alarm, at his friend. Then he signed for him to follow, and led the way into the ark, where he might pursue the subject unheard by those whose feelings he feared might get the mastery over their reason. Here he stopped, and pursued the conversation in a more confidential tone. "'Twas a little unreasonable in you, Sarpent," he said, "to bring up such a subject afore Hist, and when the young women of my own color might overhear what was said. Yes, 'twas a little more unreasonable than most things that you do. No matter. Hist didn't comprehend, and the other didn't hear. Howsever, the question is easier put than answered. No mortal can say where he will be when the sun rises to-morrow. I will ask you the same question, Sarpent, and should like to hear what answer you can give." "Chingachgook will be with his friend Deerslayer. If he be in the land of spirits, the Great Serpent will crawl at his side. If beneath yonder sun, its warmth and light shall fall on both." "I understand you, Delaware," returned the other, touched with the simple self-devotion of his friend. "Such language is as plain in one tongue as in another. It comes from the heart, and goes to the heart, too. 'Tis well to think so, and it may be well to say so, for that matter, but it would not be well to do so, Sarpent. You are no longer alone in life, for though you have the lodges to change, and other ceremonies to go through, afore Hist becomes your lawful wife, yet are you as good as married in all that bears on the feelin's, and joy, and misery. No, no, Hist must not be desarted, because a cloud is passing atween you and me, a little unexpectedly, and a little darker than we may have looked for. Hist is a daughter of the Mohicans. She knows how to obey her husband. Where he goes, she will follow. Both will be with the great hunter of the Delawares, when the sun shall be in the pine to-morrow." "The Lord bless and protect you! Chief, this is downright madness. Can either, or both of you, alter a Mingo nature? Will your grand looks, or Hist's tears and beauty, change a wolf into a squirrel, or make a catamount as innocent as a fawn? No, Sarpent, you will think better of this matter, and leave me in the hands of God. A'ter all, it's by no means sartain that the scamps design the torments, for they may yet be pitiful, and bethink them of the wickedness of such a course, though it is but a hopeless expectation to look forward to a Mingo's turning aside from evil, and letting marcy get uppermost in his heart. Nevertheless, no one knows to a sartainty what will happen, and young creatur's, like Hist, ain't going to be risked on unsartainties. This marrying is altogether a different undertaking from what some young men fancy. Now, if you was single, or as good as single, Delaware, I should expect you to be active and stirring about the camp of the vagabonds, from sunrise to sunset, sarcumventing and contriving, as restless as a hound off the scent, and doing all manner of things to help me, and to distract the inimy. But two are oftener feebler than one, and we must take things as they are, and not as we want 'em to be." "Listen, Deerslayer," returned the Indian with an emphasis so decided as to show how much he was in earnest. "If Chingachgook was in the hands of the Hurons, what would my pale-face brother do? Sneak off to the Delaware villages, and say to the chiefs, and old men, and young warriors, 'See, here is Wah ta Wah, she is safe, but a little tired, and here is the son of Uncas, not as tired as the honeysuckle, being stronger, but just as safe.' Would he do this? Well, that's uncommon ingenious. It's cunning enough for a Mingo, himself. The Lord only knows what put it into your head to ask such a question. What would I do? Why, in the first place, Hist wouldn't be likely to be in my company at all, for she would stay as near you as possible, and therefore all that part about her couldn't be said without talking nonsense. As for her being tired, that would fall through too, if she didn't go, and no part of your speech would be likely to come from me. So you see, Sarpent, reason is ag'in you, and you may as well give it up, since to hold out ag'in reason is no way becoming a chief of your character and reputation." "My brother is not himself. He forgets that he is talking to one who has sat at the council fire of his nation," returned the other kindly. "When men speak, they should say that which does not go in at one side of the head and out at the other. Their words shouldn't be feathers, so light that a wind which does not ruffle the water can blow them away. He has not answered my question. When a chief puts a question, his friend should not talk of other things." "I understand you, Delaware. I understand well enough what you mean, and truth won't allow me to say otherwise. Still, it's not as easy to answer as you seem to think, for this plain reason. You wish me to say what I would do if I had a betrothed as you have, here, on the lake, and a fri'nd yonder in the Huron camp in danger of the torments. That's it, isn't it?" The Indian bowed his head silently, and always with unmoved gravity, though his eye twinkled at the sight of the other's embarrassment. "Well, I never had a betrothed, never had the kind of feelin's toward any young woman you have towards Hist, though the Lord knows my feelin's are kind enough towards 'em all. Still my heart, as they call it in such matters, isn't touched, and therefore I can't say what I would do. A fri'nd pulls strong, that I know by exper'ence, Sarpent, but, by all that I've seen and heard consarning love, I'm led to think that a betrothed pulls stronger." "True, but the betrothed of Chingachgook does not pull towards the lodges of the Delawares. She pulls towards the camp of the Hurons." "She's a noble gal, for all her little feet, and hands that ain't bigger than a child's, and a voice that is as pleasant as a mocker's. She's a noble gal, and like the stock of her sires. Well, what is it, Sarpent, for I conclude that she hasn't changed her mind, and means to give herself up, and turn Huron wife. What is it you want?" "Wah ta Wah will never live in the wigwam of an Iroquois," answered the Delaware dryly. "She has little feet, but they can carry her to the villages of her people. She has small hands, too, but her mind is large. My brother will see what we can do when the time shall come, rather than let him die under Mingo torments." "Attempt nothing heedlessly, Delaware," said the other earnestly. "I suppose you must and will have your way, and on the whole it's right you should, for you'd neither be happy unless something was undertaken. But attempt nothing heedlessly. I didn't expect you'd quit the lake, while my matter remained in unsartainty. But remember, Sarpent, that no torments that Mingo ingenuity can invent, No tauntings and revilings, no burnings and roastings and nail-tearings, nor any other unhuman contrivances can so soon break down my spirit as to find that you and Hist have fallen into the power of the inimy in striving to do something for my good. The Delawares are prudent. The Deerslayer will not find them running into a strange camp with their eyes shut." Here the dialogue terminated. Hetty announced that the breakfast was ready, and the whole party was soon seated around the simple board, in the usual primitive manner of borderers. Judith was the last to take her seat, pale, silent, and betraying in her countenance that she had passed a painful if not a sleepless night. At this meal scarce a syllable was exchanged, all the females manifesting want of appetites, though the two men were unchanged in this particular. It was early when the party arose, and there still remained several hours before it would be necessary for the prisoner to leave his friends. The knowledge of this circumstance, and the interest all felt in his welfare, induced the whole to assemble on the platform again, in the desire to be near the expected victim, to listen to his discourse, and if possible to show their interest in him by anticipating his wishes. Deerslayer himself, so far as human eyes could penetrate, was wholly unmoved, conversing cheerfully and naturally, though he avoided any direct allusions to the expected and great event of the day. If any evidence could be discovered of his thoughts reverting to that painful subject at all, it was in the manner in which he spoke of death and the last great change. "Grieve not, Hetty," he said, for it was while consoling this simple-minded girl for the loss of her parents that he thus betrayed his feelings, "since God has app'inted that all must die. Your parents, or them you fancied your parents, which is the same thing, have gone afore you. This is only in the order of nature, my good gal, for the aged to go first, and the young to follow. But one that had a mother like your'n, Hetty, can be at no loss to hope the best, as to how matters will turn out in another world. The Delaware here and Hist believe in happy hunting grounds, and have idees befitting their notions and gifts as red skins, but we who are of white blood hold altogether to a different doctrine. Still, I rather conclude our heaven is their land of spirits, and that the path which leads to it will be travelled by all colours alike. 'Tis unpossible for the wicked to enter on it, I will allow, but fri'nds can scarce be separated, though they are not of the same race on 'arth. Keep up your spirits, poor Hetty, and look forward to the day when you will meet your mother again, and that without pain or sorrowing." "I do expect to see mother," returned the truth-telling and simple girl, "but what will become of father?" "That's a non-plusser, Delaware," said the hunter in the Indian dialect. "Yes, that is a downright non-plusser. The Muskrat was not a saint on 'arth, and it's fair to guess he'll not be much of one hereafter. Howsever, Hetty," dropping into the English by an easy transition, "howsever, Hetty, we must all hope for the best. That is wisest, and it is much the easiest to the mind, if one can only do it. I ricommend to you, trusting to God, and putting down all misgivings and faint-hearted feelin's. It's wonderful, Judith, how different people have different notions about the future, some fancying one change, and some fancying another. I've known white teachers that have thought all was spirit, hereafter, and them ag'in that believed the body will be transported to another world, much as the red skins themselves imagine, and that we shall walk about in the flesh, and know each other, and talk together, and be friends there as we've been friends here." "Which of these opinions is most pleasing to you, Deerslayer?" asked the girl, willing to indulge his melancholy mood, and far from being free from its influence herself. "Would it be disagreeable to think that you should meet all who are now on this platform in another world, or have you known enough of us here to be glad to see us no more?" "The last would make death a bitter portion. Yes, it would. It's 8 good years since the Sarpent and I began to hunt together, and the thought that we were never to meet again would be a hard thought to me. He looks forward to the time when he shall chase a sort of spirit deer, in company, on plains where there's no thorns, or brambles, or marshes, or other hardships to overcome; whereas I can't fall into all these notions, seeing that they appear to be ag'in reason. Spirits can't eat, nor have they any use for clothes, and deer can only rightfully be chased to be slain, or slain, unless it be for the venison or the hides. Now, I find it hard to suppose that blessed spirits can be put to chasing game without an object, tormenting the dumb animals just for the pleasure and agreeableness of their own amusements. I never yet pulled a trigger on buck or doe, Judith, unless when food or clothes was wanting." "The recollection of which, Deerslayer, must now be a great consolation to you." "It is the thought of such things, my friends, that enables a man to keep his furlough. It might be done without it, I own, for the worst red skins sometimes do their duty in this matter, but it makes that which might otherwise be hard, easy, if not altogether to our liking. Nothing truly makes a bolder heart than a light conscience." Judith turned paler than ever, but she struggled for self-command, and succeeded in obtaining it. The conflict had been severe, however, and it left her so little disposed to speak that Hetty pursued the subject. This was done in the simple manner natural to the girl. "It would be cruel to kill the poor deer," she said, "in this world or any other, when you don't want their venison, or their skins. No good white man, and no good red man would do it. But it's wicked for a Christian to talk about chasing anything in heaven. Such things are not done before the face of God, and the missionary that teaches these doctrines can't be a true missionary. He must be a wolf in sheep's clothing. I suppose you know what a sheep is, Deerslayer?" "That I do, gal, and a useful creatur' it is, to such as like cloths better than skins for winter garments. I understand the natur' of sheep, though I've had but little to do with them, and the natur' of wolves, too, and can take the idee of a wolf in the fleece of a sheep, though I think it would be like to prove a hot jacket for such a beast, in the warm months." "And sin and hypocrisy are hot jackets, as they will find who put them on," returned Hetty, positively. "So the wolf would be no worse off than the sinner. Spirits don't hunt, nor trap, nor fish, nor do anything that vain men undertake, since they've none of the longings of this world to feed. Oh, mother told me all that, years ago, and I don't wish to hear it denied." "Well, my good Hetty, in that case you'd better not broach your doctrine to Hist, when she and you are alone, and the young Delaware maiden is inclined to talk religion. It's her fixed idee, I know, that the good warriors do nothing but hunt and fish in the other world, though I don't believe that she fancies any of them are brought down to trapping, which is no empl'yment for a brave. But of hunting and fishing, accordin' to her notion, they've their fill, and that, too, over the most agreeablest hunting grounds, and among game that is never out of season, and which is just active and instinctive enough to give a pleasure to death. So I wouldn't recommend it to you to start Hist on that idee." "Hist can't be so wicked as to believe any such thing," returned the other earnestly. "No Indian hunts after he is dead." "No wicked Indian, I grant you. No wicked Indian, sartainly. He is obliged to carry the ammunition, and to look on without sharing in the sport, and to cook, and to light the fires, and to do every thing that isn't manful. Now mind, I don't tell you these are my idees, but they are Hist's idees, and therefore, for the sake of peace, the less you say to her ag'in 'em, the better." "And what are your ideas of the fate of an Indian, in the other world?" demanded Judith, who had just found her voice. "Ah, gal, anything but that. I am too Christianized to expect anything so fanciful as hunting and fishing after death, nor do I believe there is one Manitou for the red skin and another for a pale face. You find different colors on 'arth, as any one may see, but you don't find different natur's. Different gifts, but only one natur'." "In what is a gift different from a natur'? Is not natur' itself a gift from God?" "Sartain, that's quick thoughted and creditable, Judith, though the main idee is wrong. A natur' is the creatur' itself, its wishes, wants, idees, and feelin's, as all are born in him. This natur' never can be changed, in the main, though it may undergo some increase or lessening. Now gifts come of sarcumstances. Thus, if you put a man in a town, he gets town gifts; in a settlement, settlement gifts; in a forest, gifts of the woods. A soldier has soldierly gifts, and a missionary preaching gifts. All these increase and strengthen, until they get to fortify natur' as it might be, and excuse 1,000 acts and idees. Still the creatur' is the same at the bottom, just as a man who is clad in regimentals is the same as the man that is clad in skins. The garments make a change to the eye, and some change in the conduct, perhaps, but none in the man. Herein lies the apology for gifts, seein' that you expect different conduct from one in silks and satins from one in homespun; though the Lord, who didn't make the dresses, but who made the creatur's themselves, looks only at his own work. This isn't real missionary doctrine, but it's as near it as a man of white colour need be. Ah's me! Little did I think to be talking of such matters to day, but it's one of our weaknesses never to know what will come to pass. Step into the Ark with me, Judith, for a minute. I wish to convarse with you." Judith complied with a willingness she could scarce conceal. Following the hunter into the cabin, she took a seat on a stool, while the young man brought Killdeer, the rifle she had given him, out of a corner, and placed himself on another, with the weapon laid upon his knees. After turning the piece round and round, and examining its lock and its breech with a sort of affectionate assiduity, he laid it down and proceeded to the subject which had induced him to desire the interview. "I understand you, Judith, to say that you gave me this rifle," he said. "I agreed to take it, because a young woman can have no particular use for firearms. The weapon has a great name, and it desarves one, and ought to of right be carried by some known and sure hand, for the best reputation may be lost by careless and thoughtless handling." "Can it be in better hands than those in which it is now, Deerslayer? Thomas Hutter seldom missed with it. With you it must turn out to be—" "Sartain death!" interrupted the hunter, laughing. "I once know'd a beaver man that had a piece he called by that very name, but 'twas all boastfulness, for I've seen Delawares that were as true with arrows at a short range. Howsever, I'll not deny my gifts, for this is a gift, Judith, and not natur'. But I'll not deny my gifts, and therefore allow that the rifle couldn't well be in better hands than it is at present. But how long will it be likely to remain there? Atween us, the truth may be said, though I shouldn't like to have it known to the Sarpent and Hist. But to you the truth may be spoken, since your feelin's will not be as likely to be tormented by it, as by those of them that have known me longer and better. How long am I like to own this rifle, or any other? That is a serious question for our thoughts to rest on, and should that happen which is so likely to happen, Killdeer would be without an owner." Judith listened with apparent composure, though the conflict within came near overpowering her. Appreciating the singular character of her companion, however, she succeeded in appearing calm, though, had not his attention been drawn exclusively to the rifle, a man of his keenness of observation could scarce have failed to detect the agony of mind with which the girl had hearkened to his words. Her great self-command, notwithstanding, enabled her to pursue the subject in a way still to deceive him. "What would you have me do with the weapon," she asked, "should that which you seem to expect take place?" "That's just what I wanted to speak to you about, Judith. That's just it. There's Chingachgook now, though far from being perfect sartainty with a rifle, for few red-skins ever get to be that, though far from being parfect sartainty, he is respectable, and is coming on. Nevertheless, he is my fri'nd, and all the better fri'nd, perhaps, because there never can be any hard feelin's atween us, touchin' our gifts, his bein' red, and mine bein' altogether white. Now I should like to leave Killdeer to the Sarpent, should anything happen to keep me from doing credit and honor to your precious gift, Judith." "Leave it to whom you please, Deerslayer. The rifle is your own, to do with as you please. Chingachgook shall have it, should you never return to claim it, if that be your wish." "Has Hetty been consulted in this matter? Property goes from the parent to the children, and not to one child in particular." "If you place your right on that of the law, Deerslayer, I fear none of us can claim to be the owner. Thomas Hutter was no more the father of Esther than he was the father of Judith. Judith and Esther we are truly, having no other name." "There may be law in that, but there's no great reason, gal. Accordin' to the custom of families, the goods are your'n, and there's no one here to gainsay it. If Hetty would only say that she is willing, my mind would be quite at ease in the matter. It's true, Judith, that your sister has neither your beauty nor your wit, but we should be the tenderest of the rights and welfare of the most weak-minded." The girl made no answer, but placing herself at a window, she summoned her sister to her side. When the question was put to Hetty, That simple-minded and affectionate creature cheerfully assented to the proposal to confer on Deerslayer a full right of ownership to the much coveted rifle. The latter now seemed perfectly happy, for the time being at least, and after again examining and re examining his prize, he expressed a determination to put its merits to a practical test, before he left the spot. No boy could have been more eager to exhibit the qualities of his trumpet, or his crossbow, than this simple forester was to prove those of his rifle. Returning to the platform, he first took the Delaware aside and informed him that this celebrated piece was to become his property, in the event of anything serious befalling himself. "This is a new reason why you should be wary, Sarpent, and not run into any uncalculated danger," the hunter added, "for it will be a victory of itself to a tribe to own such a piece as this. The Mingos will turn green with envy, and what is more, they will not venture heedlessly near a village where it is known to be kept. So look well to it, Delaware, and remember that you've now to watch over a thing that has all the valie of a creatur' without its failin's. Hist may be, and should be precious to you, but Killdeer will have the love and veneration of your whole people." "One rifle like another, Deerslayer," returned the Indian, in English, the language used by the other, a little hurt at his friend's lowering his betrothed to the level of a gun. "All kill, all wood and iron. Wife dear to heart, rifle good to shoot." "And what is a man in the woods without something to shoot with? A miserable trapper, or a forlorn broom and basket maker, at the best. Such a man may hoe corn, and keep soul and body together, but he can never know the savory morsels of venison, or tell a bear's ham from a hog's. Come, my fri'nd, such another occasion may never offer again, and I feel a strong craving for a trial with this celebrated piece. You shall bring out your own rifle, and I will just sight Killdeer in a careless way, in order that we may know a few of its secret vartues." As this proposition served to relieve the thought of the whole party, by giving them a new direction, while it was likely to produce no unpleasant results, every one was willing to enter into it, the girls bringing forth the firearms with an alacrity bordering on cheerfulness. Hutter's armory was well supplied, possessing several rifles, all of which were habitually kept loaded in readiness to meet any sudden demand for their use. On the present occasion it only remained to freshen the primings, and each piece was in a state for service. This was soon done, as all assisted in it, the females being as expert in this part of the system of defence as their male companions. "Now, Sarpent, we'll begin in a humble way, using old Tom's commoners first, and coming to your we'pon and Killdeer as the winding up observations," said Deerslayer, delighted to be again, weapon in hand, ready to display his skill. "Here's birds in abundance, some in and some over the lake, and they keep at just a good range, hovering round the hut. Speak your mind, Delaware, and p'int out the creatur' you wish to alarm. Here's a diver nearest in, off to the eastward, and that's a creatur' that buries itself at the flash, and will be like enough to try both piece and powder." Chingachgook was a man of few words. No sooner was the bird pointed out to him than he took his aim and fired. The duck dove at the flash, as had been expected, and the bullet skipped harmlessly along the surface of the lake, first striking the water within a few inches of the spot where the bird had so lately swam. Deerslayer laughed, cordially and naturally, but at the same time he threw himself into an attitude of preparation, and stood keenly watching the sheet of placid water. Presently a dark spot appeared, and then the duck arose to breathe, and shook its wings. While in this act, a bullet passed directly through its breast, actually turning it over lifeless on its back. At the next moment, Deerslayer stood with the breech of his rifle on the platform, as tranquil as if nothing had happened, though laughing in his own peculiar manner. "There's no great trial of the pieces in that," he said, as if anxious to prevent a false impression of his own merit. "No, that proof's neither for nor ag'in the rifles, seeing it was all quickness of hand and eye. I took the bird at a disadvantage, or he might have got under again, afore the bullet reached him. But the Sarpent is too wise to mind such tricks, having long been used to them. Do you remember the time, chief, when you thought yourself sartain of the wild goose, and I took him out of your very eyes, as it might be with a little smoke? Howsever, such things pass for nothing atween friends, and young folk will have their fun, Judith. Ay, here's just the bird we want, for it's as good for the fire as it is for the aim, and nothing should be lost that can be turned to just account. There, further north, Delaware." The latter looked in the required direction, and he soon saw a large black duck floating in stately repose on the water. At that distant day, when so few men were present to derange the harmony of the wilderness, all the smaller lakes with which the interior of New York so abounds, were places of resort for the migratory aquatic birds, and this sheet, like the others, had once been much frequented by all the varieties of the duck, by the goose, the gull, and the loon. On the appearance of Hutter, the spot was comparatively deserted for other sheets, more retired and remote, though some of such species continued to resort thither, as indeed they do in the present hour. At that instant 100 birds were visible from the castle, sleeping on the water or laying their feathers in the limpid element, though no other offered so favorable a mark as that Deerslayer had just pointed out to his friend. Chingachgook, as usual, spared his words, and proceeded to execution. This time his aim was more careful than before, and his success in proportion. The bird had a wing crippled, and fluttered along the water screaming, materially increasing its distance from its enemies. "That bird must be put out of pain," exclaimed Deerslayer, the moment the animal endeavored to rise on the wing, "and this is the rifle and the eye to do it." The duck was still floundering along, when the fatal bullet overtook it, severing the head from the neck, as neatly as if it had been done with an axe. Hist had indulged in a low cry of delight at the success of the young Indian, but now she affected to frown and resent the greater skill of his friend. The chief, on the contrary, uttered the usual exclamation of pleasure, and his smile proved how much he admired, and how little he envied. "Never mind the gal, Sarpent; never mind Hist's feelin's, which will neither choke nor drown, slay nor beautify," said Deerslayer, laughing. "'Tis natural for women to enter into their husbands' victories and defeats, and you are as good as man and wife, so far as prejudyce and friendship go. Here is a bird overhead that will put the pieces to the proof. I challenge you to an upward aim, with a flying target. That's a ra'al proof, and one that needs sartain rifles, as well as sartain eyes." The species of eagle that frequents the water and lives on fish was also present, and one was hovering at a considerable height above the hut, greedily watching for an opportunity to make a swoop, its hungry young elevating their heads from a nest that was in sight, in the naked summit of a dead pine. Chingachgook silently turned a new piece against this bird, and after carefully watching his time, fired. A wider circuit than common denoted that the messenger had passed through the air at no great distance from the bird, though it missed its object. Deerslayer, whose aim was not more true than it was quick, fired as soon as it was certain his friend had missed, and the deep swoop that followed left it momentarily doubtful whether the eagle was hit or not. The marksman himself, however, proclaimed his own want of success, calling on his friend to seize another rifle, for he saw signs on the part of the bird of an intention to quit the spot. "I made him weak, Sarpent. I do think his feathers were ruffled, but no blood has yet been drawn, nor is that old piece fit for so nice and quick a sight. Quick, Delaware, you've now a better rifle, and Judith, bring out Killdeer, for this is the occasion to try his merits, if he has 'em." A general movement followed. Each of the competitors got ready, and the girls stood in eager expectation of the result. The eagle had made a wide circuit after his low swoop, and fanning his way upward, once more hovered nearly over the hut, at a distance even greater than before. Chingachgook gazed at him, and then expressed his opinion of the impossibility of striking a bird at that great height, and while he was so nearly perpendicular as to the range. But a low murmur from Hist produced a sudden impulse, and he fired. The result showed how well he had calculated, the eagle not even varying his flight, sailing round and round in his airy circle, and looking down, as if in contempt, at his foes. "Now, Judith," cried Deerslayer, laughing, with glistening and delighted eyes, "we'll see if Killdeer isn't killed eagle, too. Give me room, Sarpent, and watch the reason of the aim, for by reason anything may be l'arned." A careful sight followed, and was repeated again and again, the bird continuing to rise higher and higher. Then followed the flash and the report. The swift messenger sped upward, and at the next instant the bird turned on its side, and came swooping down, now struggling with one wing and then with the other, sometimes whirling in a circuit, next fanning desperately as if conscious of its injury, until, having described several complete circles around the spot, it fell heavily into the end of the ark. On examining the body, it was found that the bullet had pierced it about halfway between one of its wings and the breastbone. Chapter 25. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 26. Upon two stony tables spread before her, she leaned her bosom, more than stony hard. There slept the impartial judge and strict restorer of wrong, or right, with pain or with reward. There hung the score of all our debts, the card where good and bad and life and death were painted. Was never heart of mortal so untainted, but when the roll was read, with thousand terrors fainted. Giles Fletcher, Christ's Victory in Heaven. 65. We've done an unthoughtful thing, Sarpent, yes, Judith, we've done an unthoughtful thing in taking life with an object no better than vanity, exclaimed Deerslayer, when the Delaware held up the enormous bird by its wings, and exhibited the dying eyes riveted on its enemies with the gaze that the helpless ever fasten on their destroyers. 'Twas more becomin' two boys to gratify their feelin's in this unthoughtful manner, than two warriors on a war path, even though it be their first. Ah's me! Well, as a punishment, I'll quit you at once, and when I find myself alone with them bloody-minded Mingos, it's more than like I'll have occasion to remember that life is sweet, even to the beasts of the woods and the fowls of the air. There, Judith, there's Killdeer. Take him back ag'in, and keep him for some hand that's more desarving to own such a piece." "I know none as deserving as your own, Deerslayer," answered the girl in haste. "None but yours shall keep the rifle." "If it depended on skill, you might be right enough, gal, but we should know when to use firearms, as well as how to use 'em. I haven't l'arnt the first duty yet, it seems, so keep the piece till I have. The sight of a dyin' and distressed creatur', even though it be only a bird, brings wholesome thoughts to a man who don't know how soon his own time may come, and who is pretty sartain that it will come afore the sun sets. I'd give back all my vain feelin's, and rejicin's in hand and eye, if that poor eagle was only on its nest ag'in, with its young, praisin' the Lord for anything that we can know about the matter, for health and strength." The listeners were confounded with this proof of sudden repentance in the hunter, and that, too, for an indulgence so very common, that men seldom stop to weigh its consequences, or the physical suffering it may bring on the unoffending and helpless. The Delaware understood what was said, though he scarce understood the feelings which had prompted the words, and by way of disposing of the difficulty, he drew his keen knife and severed the head of the sufferer from its body. "What a thing is power," continued the hunter, "and what a thing it is to have it, and not to know how to use it! It's no wonder, Judith, that the great so often fail of their duties, when even the little and the humble find it so hard to do what's right, and not to do what's wrong. Then, how one evil act brings others a'ter it. Now, wasn't it for this furlough of mine, which must soon take me back to the Mingos, I'd find this creatur's nest, if I travelled the woods a fortnight, though an eagle's nest is soon found by them that understands the bird's natur'. But I'd travel a fortnight rather than not find it, just to put the young, too, out of their pain." "I'm glad to hear you say this, Deerslayer," observed Hetty, "and God will be more apt to remember your sorrow for what you've done, than the wickedness itself. I thought how wicked it was to kill harmless birds, while you were shooting, and meant to tell you so; but I don't know how it happened. I was so curious to see if you could hit an eagle at so great a height, that I forgot altogether to speak till the mischief was done." "That's it. That's just it, my good Hetty. We can all see our faults and mistakes when it's too late to help them. Howsever, I'm glad you didn't speak, for I don't think a word or two would have stopped me, just at that moment, and so the sin stands in its nakedness, and not aggravated by any unheeded calls to forbear. Well, well, bitter thoughts are hard to be borne at all times, but there's times when they're harder than at others." Little did Deerslayer know, while thus indulging in feelings that were natural to the man, and so strictly in accordance with his own unsophisticated and just principles, that in the course of the inscrutable Providence, which so uniformly and yet so mysteriously covers all events with its mantle, the very fault he was disposed so severely to censure was to be made the means of determining his own earthly fate. The mode and the moment in which he was to feel the influence of this interference it would be premature to relate, but both will appear in the course of the succeeding chapters. As for the young man, he now slowly left the ark, like one sorrowing for his misdeeds, and seated himself in silence on the platform. By this time the sun had ascended to some height, and its appearance, taken in connection with his present feelings, induced him to prepare to depart. The Delaware got the canoe ready for his friend, as soon as apprised of his intention, while Hist busied herself in making the few arrangements that were thought necessary to his comfort. All this was done without ostentation, but in a way that left Deerslayer fully acquainted with, and equally disposed to appreciate, the motive. When all was ready, both returned to the side of Judith and Hetty, neither of whom had moved from the spot where the young hunter sat. "The best friends must often part," the last began, when he saw the whole party grouped around him. "Yes, fri'ndship can't alter the ways of Providence, and let our feelin's be as they may, we must part. I've often thought there's moments when our words dwell longer on the mind than common, and when advice is remembered, just because the mouth that gives it isn't likely to give it, ag'in. No one knows what will happen in this world, and therefore it may be well, when fri'nds separate, under a likelihood that the parting may be long, to say a few words in kindness, as a sort of keepsake. If all but one will go into the ark, I'll talk to each in turn, and what is more, I'll listen to what you may have to say back ag'in, for it's a poor counsellor that won't take as well as give." As the meaning of the speaker was understood, the two Indians immediately withdrew as desired, leaving the sisters, however, still standing at the young man's side. A look of Deerslayer's induced Judith to explain. "You can advise Hetty as you land," she said hastily, "for I intend that she shall accompany you to the shore." "Is this wise, Judith? It's true that, under common circumstances, a female mind is a great protection among red skins, but when their feelin's are up, and they're bent on revenge, it's hard to say what may come to pass. Besides—" "What were you about to say, Deerslayer?" asked Judith, whose gentleness of voice and manner amounted nearly to tenderness, though she struggled hard to keep her emotions and apprehensions in subjection. "Why, simply that there are sights and doin's that one, even as little gifted with reason and memory as Hetty here, might better not witness. So, Judith, you would do well to let me land alone, and to keep your sister back." "Never fear for me, Deerslayer," put in Hetty, who comprehended enough of the discourse to know its general drift. "I'm feeble minded, and that, they say, is an excuse for going anywhere, and what that won't excuse will be overlooked on account of the Bible I always carry. It is wonderful, Judith, how all sorts of men, the trappers as well as the hunters, red men as well as white, Mingos as well as Delawares, do reverence and fear the Bible." "I think you have not the least ground to fear any injury, Hetty," answered the sister, "and therefore I shall insist on your going to the Huron camp with our friend. Your being there can do no harm, not even to yourself, and may do great good to Deerslayer." "This is not a moment, Judith, to dispute, and so have the matter your own way," returned the young man. "Get yourself ready, Hetty, and go into the canoe, for I've a few parting words to say to your sister, which can do you no good." Judith and her companion continued silent, until Hetty had so far complied as to leave them alone, when Deerslayer took up the subject, as if it had been interrupted by some ordinary occurrence, and in a very matter-of-fact way. "Words spoken at parting, and which may be the last we ever hear from a fri'nd, are not soon forgotten," he repeated, "and so, Judith, I intend to speak to you like a brother, seein' I'm not old enough to be your father. In the first place, I wish to caution you ag'in your inimies, of which two may be said to haunt your very footsteps, and to beset your ways. The first is oncommon good looks, which is as dangerous a foe to some young women as a whole tribe of Mingos should prove, and which calls for great watchfulness, not to admire and praise, but to distrust and sarcumvent. Yes, good looks may be sarcumvented, and fairly outwitted too. In order to do this you've only to remember that they melt like the snows, and when once gone, they never come back ag'in. The seasons come and go, Judith, and if we have winter with storms and frosts, and spring with chills and leafless trees, we have summer with its sun and glorious skies, and fall with its fruits, and a garment thrown over the forest, that no beauty of the town could rummage out of all the shops in America. 'Arth is an eternal round, the goodness of God bringing back the pleasant when we've had enough of the unpleasant. But it's not so with good looks. They are lent for a short time in youth, to be used and not abused, and, as I never met with a young woman to whom Providence has been as bountiful as it has to you, Judith, in this particular, I warn you, as it might be with my dyin' breath, to beware of the inimy, fri'nd or enemy, as we deal with the gift." It was so grateful to Judith to hear these unequivocal admissions of her personal charms, that much would have been forgiven to the man who made them, let him be who he might. But at that moment, and from a far better feeling, it would not have been easy for Deerslayer seriously to offend her, and she listened with a patience which, had it been foretold only a week earlier, it would have excited her indignation to hear. "I understand your meaning, Deerslayer," returned the girl, with a meekness and humility that a little surprised her listener, "and hope to be able to profit by it. But you have mentioned only one of the enemies I have to fear. Who, or what, is the other?" "The other is given way before your own good sense and judgment, I find, Judith. Yes, he's not as dangerous as I supposed. Howsever, havin' opened the subject, it will be as well to end it honestly. The first enemy you have to be watchful of, as I've already told you, Judith, is oncommon good looks, and the next is an oncommon knowledge of the sarcumstance. If the first is bad, the last doesn't in any way mend the matter, so far as safety and peace of mind are consarned." How much longer the young man would have gone on in his simple and unsuspecting but well intentioned manner, it might not be easy to say, had he not been interrupted by his listeners bursting into tears, and giving way to an outbreak of feeling, which was so much the more violent from the fact that it had been with so much difficulty suppressed. At first her sobs were so violent and uncontrollable that Deerslayer was a little appalled, and he was abundantly repentant from the instant that he discovered how much greater was the effect produced by his words than he had anticipated. Even the austere and exacting are usually appeased by the signs of contrition, but the nature of Deerslayer did not require proofs of intense feeling so strong in order to bring him down to a level with the regrets felt by the girl herself. He arose, as if an adder had stung him, and the accents of the mother that soothes her child were scarcely more gentle and winning than the tones of his voice, as he now expressed his contrition at having gone so far. "It was well meant, Judith," he said, "but it was not intended to hurt your feelin's so much. I have overdone the advice, I see. Yes, I've overdone it, and I crave your pardon for the same. Fri'ndship is an awful thing. Sometimes it chides us for not having done enough, and then, ag'in, it speaks in strong words for having done too much. Howsever, I acknowledge I've overdone the matter, and as I've a ra'al and strong regard for you, I rej'ice to say it, inasmuch as it proves how much better you are than my own vanity and consaits had made you out to be." Judith now removed her hands from her face. Her tears had ceased, and she unveiled a countenance so winning with the smile which rendered it even radiant, that the young man gazed at her for a moment with speechless delight. "Say no more, Deerslayer," she hastily interposed. "It pains me to hear you find fault with yourself. I know my own weakness, all the better, now I see you have discovered it. The lesson, bitter as I have found it for a moment, shall not be forgotten. We will not talk any longer of these things, for I do not feel myself brave enough for the undertaking, and I should not like the Delaware, or Hist, or even Hetty, to notice my weakness. Farewell, Deerslayer. May God bless and protect you as your honest heart deserves blessings and protection, and as I must think he will." Judith had so far regained the superiority that properly belonged to her better education high spirit and surpassing personal advantages, as to preserve the ascendancy she had thus accidentally obtained, and effectually prevented any return to the subject that was as singularly interrupted, as it had been singularly introduced. The young man permitted her to have everything her own way, and when she pressed his hard hand in both her own, he made no resistance, but submitted to the homage as quietly, and with quite as matter of course a manner, as a sovereign would have received a similar tribute from a subject, or the mistress from her suitor. Feeling had flushed the face and illuminated the whole countenance of the girl, and her beauty was never more resplendent than when she cast a parting glance at the youth. That glance was filled with anxiety, interest, and gentle pity. At the next instant she darted into the hut and was seen no more, though she spoke to Hist from a window to inform her that their friend expected her appearance. "You know enough of red skin natur', and red skin usages, Wah ta Wah, to see the condition I am in on account of this furlough," commenced the hunter in Delaware, as soon as the patient and submissive girl of that people had moved quietly to his side. "You will therefore best understand how unlikely I am ever to talk with you again. I've but little to say, but that little comes from long livin' among your people, and from havin' obsarved and noted their usages. The life of a woman is hard at the best, but I must own, though I'm not opinionated in favor of my own colour, that it is harder among the red men than it is among the pale faces. This is a p'int on which Christians may well boast, if boasting can be set down for Christianity in any manner or form, which I rather think it cannot. Howsever, all women have their trials. Red women have theirn in what I should call the nat'ral way, while white women take them inoculated like. Bear your burthen, Hist, becomingly, and remember, if it be a little toilsome, how much lighter it is than that of most Indian women. I know the Sarpent well, what I call cordially, and he will never be a tyrant to anything he loves, though he will expect to be treated himself like a Mohican chief. There will be cloudy days in your lodge, I suppose, for they happen under all usages, and among all people. But by keepin' the windows of your heart open there will always be room for the sunshine to enter. You come of a great stock yourself, and so does Chingachgook. It's not very likely that either will ever forget the sarcumstance and do anything to disgrace your forefathers. Nevertheless, lichen is a tender plant, and never thrives long when watered with tears. Let the 'arth around your married happiness be moistened by the dews of kindness." "My pale brother is very wise. Wah will keep in her mind all that his wisdom tells her." "That's judicious and womanly, Hist. Care in listening, and stout-heartedness in holding to good counsel, is a wife's great protection. And now, ask the Sarpent to come and speak with me, for a moment, and carry away with you all my best wishes and prayers. I shall think of you, Hist, and of your intended husband, let what may come to pass, and always wish you well, here and hereafter, whether the last is to be according to Indian idees, or Christian doctrines." Hist shed no tear at parting. She was sustained by the high resolution of one who had decided on her course, but her dark eyes were luminous with the feelings that glowed within, and her pretty countenance beamed with an expression of determination that was in marked and singular contrast to its ordinary gentleness. It was but a minute ere the Delaware advanced to the side of his friend with the light, noiseless tread of an Indian. "Come this a way, Sarpent. Here, more out of sight of the women," commenced the Deerslayer, "for I've several things to say that mustn't so much as be suspected, much less overheard. You know too well the natur' of furloughs and Mingos to have any doubts or misgivin's consarnin' what is like to happen, when I get back to the camp. On them 2 p'ints, therefore, a few words will go a great way. In the first place, chief, I wish to say a little about Hist, and the manner in which you red men treat your wives. I suppose it's accordin' to the gifts of your people that the women should work, and the men hunt; but there's such a thing as moderation in all matters. As for huntin', I see no good reason why any limit should be set to that, but Hist comes of too good a stock to toil like a common drudge. One of your means and standin' need never want for corn, or potatoes, or any thing that the fields yield. Therefore, I hope the hoe will never be put into the hands of any wife of your'n. You know I am not quite a beggar, and all I own, whether in ammunition, skins, arms, or calicoes, I give to Hist, should I not come back to claim them by the end of the season. This will set the maiden up, and will buy labor for her for a long time to come. I suppose I needn't tell you to love the young woman, for that you do already, and whomsoever the man ra'ally loves, he'll be likely enough to cherish. Nevertheless, it can do no harm to say that kind words never rankle, while bitter words do. I know you're a man, Sarpent, that is less apt to talk in his own lodge, than to speak at the council fire, but forgetful moments may overtake us all, and the practice of kind doin', and kind talkin', is a wonderful advantage in keepin' peace in a cabin, as well as on a hunt." "My ears are open," returned the Delaware gravely. "The words of my brother have entered so far that they can never fall out again. They are like rings that have no end, and cannot drop. Let him speak on. The song of the wren and the voice of a friend never tire." "I will speak a little longer, chief, but you will excuse it for the sake of old companionship, should I now talk about myself. If the worst comes to the worst, it's not likely there'll be much left of me but ashes. So a grave would be useless, and a sort of vanity. On that score I'm no way particular, though it might be well enough to take a look at the remains of the pile, and should any bones or pieces be found, 'twould be more decent to gather them together and bury them, than to let them lie for the wolves to gnaw at, and howl over. These matters can make no great difference in the mind, but men of white blood and Christian feelin's have rather a gift for graves." "It shall be done as my brother says," returned the Indian gravely. "If his mind is full, let him empty it in the bosom of a friend." "I thank you, Sarpent. My mind's easy enough, yes, it's tolerable easy. Idees will come uppermost that I'm not apt to think about in common, it's true, but by striving ag'in some, and lettin' other some out, all will come right in the long run. There's one thing, howsever, chief, that does seem to me to be onreasonable, and ag'in natur', though the missionaries say it's true, and bein' of my religion and color I feel bound to believe them. They say an Injin may torment and torture the body to his heart's content, and scalp, and cut, and tear, and burn, and consume all his inventions and deviltries until nothin' is left but ashes, and they shall be scattered to the four winds of heaven. Yet when the trumpet of God shall sound, all will come together again, and the man will stand forth in his flesh the same creatur' as to looks, if not as to feelin's, that he was afore he was harmed." "The missionaries are good men, mean well," returned the Delaware courteously. "They are not great medicines. They think all they say, Deerslayer. That is no reason why warriors and orators should be all ears. When Chingachgook shall see the father of Tannemund standing in his scalp, and paint, and warlock, then will he believe the missionaries." "Seein' is believin', of a sartainty. Ah's me! And some of us may see these things sooner than we thought. I comprehend your meanin' about Tannemund's father, Sarpent, and the idee's a close idee. Tannemund is now an elderly man, say 80 every day of it, and his father was scalped, and tormented, and burnt, when the present prophet was a youngster. Yes, if one could see that come to pass, there wouldn't be much difficulty in yieldin' faith to all that the missionaries say. Howsever, I am not ag'in the opinion now, for you must know, Sarpent, that the great principle of Christianity is to believe without seeing, and a man should always act up to his religion and principles, let them be what they may." "That is strange for a wise nation," said the Delaware with emphasis. "The red man looks hard, that he may see and understand." "Yes, that's plauserble, and is agreeable to mortal pride, but it's not as deep as it seems. If we could understand all we see, Sarpent, there might be not only sense, but safety, in refusin' to give faith to any one thing that we might find uncomperhensible. But when there's so many things about which it may be said we know nothin' at all, why there's little use, and no reason, in bein' difficult touchin' any one in particular. For my part, Delaware, all my thoughts haven't been on the game, when outlyin' in the hunts and scoutin's of our youth. Many's the hour I've passed pleasantly enough, too, in what is tarmed conterplation by my people. On such occasions the mind is active, though the body seems lazy and listless. An open spot on a mountain side, where a wide look can be had at the heavens and the 'arth, is a most judicious place for a man to get a just idee of the power of the Manitou, and of his own littleness. At such times there isn't any great disposition to find fault with little difficulties, in the way of comprehension, as there are so many big ones to hide them. Believin' comes easy enough to me at such times, and if the Lord made man first out of 'arth, as they tell me it is written in the Bible, then turns him into dust at death, I see no great difficulty in the way to bringin' him back in the body, though ashes be the only substance left. These things lie beyond our understandin', though they may and do lie so close to our feelin's. But of all the doctrines, Sarpent, that which disturbs me, and disconsarts my mind the most, is the one which teaches us to think that a pale face goes to one heaven, and a red skin to another. It may separate in death them which lived much together, and loved each other well in life." "Do the missionaries teach their white brethren to think it is so?" demanded the Indian, with serious earnestness. "The Delawares believe that good men and brave warriors will hunt together in the same pleasant woods, let them belong to whatever tribe they may; that all the unjust Indians and cowards will have to sneak in with the dogs and the wolves to get venison for their lodges. 'Tis wonderful how many consaits mankind have consarnin' happiness and misery hereafter!" exclaimed the hunter, borne away by the power of his own thoughts. "Some believe in burnin's and flames, and some think punishment is to eat with the wolves and dogs. Then ag'in, some fancy heaven to be only the carryin' out of their own 'arthly longin's, while others fancy it all gold and shinin' lights. Well, I've an idee of my own in that matter, which is just this, Sarpent. Whenever I've done wrong, I've gin'rally found 'twas owin' to some blindness of the mind, which hid the right from view; and when sight has returned, then has some sorrow and repentance. Now I consait that after death, when the body is laid aside, or if used at all it is purified and without its longin's, the spirit sees all things in their ra'al lights, and never becomes blind to truth and justice. Such bein' the case, all that has been done in life is beheld as plainly as the sun is seen at noon. The good brings joy, while the evil brings sorrow. There's nothin' unreasonable in that, but it's agreeable to every man's exper'ence." "I thought the pale faces believed all men were wicked. Who then could ever find the white man's heaven?" "That's ingen'ous, but it falls short of the missionary teachin's. You'll be Christianized one day, I make no doubt, and then 'twill all come plain enough. You must know, Sarpent, that there's been a great deed of salvation done, that by God's help enables all men to find a pardon for their wickedness, and that is the essence of the white man's religion. I can't stop to talk this matter over with you any longer, for Hetty's in the canoe, and the furlough takes me away. But the time will come when I hope you'll feel these things, for, after all, they must be felt rather than reasoned about. Ah's me! Well, Delaware, there's my hand. You know it's that of a fri'nd, and will shake it as such, though it never has done you one half the good its owner wishes it had." The Indian took the offered hand, and returned its pressure warmly. Then, falling back on his acquired stoicism of manner, which so many mistake for constitutional indifference, he drew up in reserve, and prepared to part from his friend with dignity. Deerslayer, however, was more natural, nor could he have at all cared about giving way to his feelings, had not the recent conduct and language of Judith given him some secret though ill-defined apprehensions of a scene. He was too humble to imagine the truth concerning the actual feelings of that beautiful girl, while he was too observant not to have noted the struggle she had maintained with herself, and which had so often led her to the very verge of discovery. That something extraordinary was concealed in her breast he thought obvious enough, and through a sentiment of manly delicacy that would have done credit to the highest human refinement, he shrunk from any exposure of her secret that might subsequently cause regret to the girl herself. He therefore determined to depart, now, and that without any further manifestations of feeling either from him or from others. "God bless you, Sarpent, God bless you!" cried the hunter, as the canoe left the side of the platform. "Your Manitou and my God only know when and where we shall meet ag'in. I shall count it a great blessing, and a full reward for any little good I may have done on 'arth, if we shall be permitted to know each other, and to consort together, hereafter, as we have so long done in these pleasant woods afore us." Chingachgook waved his hand. Drawing the light blanket he wore over his head, as a Roman would conceal his grief in his robes, he slowly withdrew into the ark, in order to indulge his sorrow and his musings alone. Deerslayer did not speak again until the canoe was half-way to the shore. Then he suddenly ceased paddling, at an interruption that came from the mild, musical voice of Hetty. "Why do you go back to the Hurons, Deerslayer?" demanded the girl. "They say I am feeble-minded, and such they never harm; but you have as much sense as Hurry Harry, and more, too, Judith thinks, though I don't see how that can well be." "Ah, Hetty, afore we land I must convarse a little with you, child, and that, too, on matters touching your own welfare, principally. Stop paddling, or rather, that the Mingos needn't think we are plotting and contriving, and so treat us accordingly, just dip your paddle, lightly, and give the canoe a little motion, and no more. That's just the idee, and the movement. I see you're ready enough at an appearance, and might be made useful at a sarcumvention if it was lawful now to use one. That's just the idee and the movement. Ah's me! Deceit and a false tongue are evil things, and altogether unbecoming our colour, Hetty, but it is a pleasure and a satisfaction to outdo the contrivances of a red skin in the strife of lawful warfare. My path has been short, and is like soon to have an end, but I can see that the wanderings of a warrior aren't altogether among brambles and difficulties. There's a bright side to a war path, as well as to most other things, if we'll only have the wisdom to see it, and the generosity to own it." "And why should your war path, as you call it, come so near to an end, Deerslayer?" "Because, my good girl, my furlough comes so near to an end. They're likely to have pretty much the same tarmination as regards time, one following on the heels of the other, as a matter of course." "I don't understand your meaning, Deerslayer," returned the girl, looking a little bewildered. "Mother always said people ought to speak more plainly to me than most other persons, because I'm feeble-minded. Those that are feeble-minded don't understand as easily as those that have sense." "Well then, Hetty, the simple truth is this. You know that I'm now a captive to the Hurons, and captives can't do, in all things, as they please." "But how can you be a captive," eagerly interrupted the girl, "when you are out here on the lake in father's best canoe, and the Indians are in the woods with no canoe at all? That can't be true, Deerslayer." "I wish with all my heart and soul, Hetty, that you was right, and that I was wrong, instead of your bein' all wrong and I bein' only too near the truth. Free as I seem to your eyes, gal, I'm bound hand and foot in reality." "Well, it is a great misfortune not to have sense. Now I can't see or understand that you are a captive, or bound in any manner. If you are bound, with what are your hands and feet fastened?" "With a furlough, gal. That's a thong that binds tighter than any chain. One may be broken, but the other can't. Ropes and chains allow of knives, and deceit, and contrivances, but a furlough can be neither cut, slipped, nor sarcumvented." "What sort of a thing is a furlough, then, if it be stronger than hemp or iron? I never saw a furlough." "I hope you may never feel one, gal. The tie is altogether in the feelin's, in these matters, and therefore is to be felt and not seen. You can understand what it is to give a promise, I dare say, good little Hetty." "Certainly. A promise is to say you will do a thing, and that binds you to be as good as your word. Mother always kept her promises to me, and then she said it would be wicked if I didn't keep my promises to her, and to everybody else." "You have had a good mother, in some matters, child, whatever she may have been in other some. That is a promise, and as you say it must be kept. Now, I fell into the hands of the Mingos last night, and they let me come off to see my friends and send messages in to my own colour, if any such feel consarn in my account, on condition that I shall be back when the sun is up to day, and take whatever their revenge and hatred can contrive in the way of torments, in satisfaction for the life of a warrior that fell by my rifle, as well as for that of the young woman shot by Hurry, and other disapp'intments met with on and about this lake. What is called a promise atween mother and darter, or even atween strangers in the settlements, is called a furlough, when given by one soldier to another on a war path, and now I suppose you understand my situation, Hetty." The girl made no answer for some time, but she ceased paddling altogether, as if the novel idea distracted her mind too much to admit of other employment. Then she resumed the dialogue earnestly and with solicitude. "Do you think the Hurons will have the heart to do what you say, Deerslayer?" she asked. "I have found them kind and harmless." "That's true enough as consarns one like you, Hetty, but it's a very different affair when it comes to an open inimy, and he too the owner of a pretty sartain rifle. I don't say that they bear me special malice on account of any expl'ites already performed, for that would be bragging, as it might be, on the verge of the grave, but it's no vanity to believe that they know one of their bravest and cunningest chiefs fell by my hands. Such being the case, the tribe would reproach them if they failed to send the spirit of a pale face to keep the company of the spirit of their red brother, always supposin' that he can catch it. I look for no marcy, Hetty, at their hands, and my principal sorrow is that such a calamity should befall me on my first warpath. That it would come sooner or later, every soldier counts on and expects." "The Hurons shall not harm you, Deerslayer," cried the girl, much excited. "'Tis wicked as well as cruel. I have the Bible here, to tell them so. Do you think I would stand by and see you tormented?" "I hope not, my good Hetty, I hope not; and therefore, when the moment comes, I expect you will move off, and not be a witness of what you can't help, while it would grieve you. But I haven't stopped the paddles to talk of my own afflictions and difficulties, but to speak a little plainly to you, gal, consarnin' your own matters." "What can you say to me, Deerslayer? Since mother died, few talk to me of such things." "So much the worse, poor gal. Yes, 'tis so much the worse, for one of your state of mind needs frequent talking to, in order to escape the snares and desaits of this wicked world. You haven't forgotten Hurry Harry, gal, so soon, I calculate." "I forget Henry March!" exclaimed Hetty, starting. "Why should I forget him, Deerslayer, when he is our friend, and only left us last night? Then the large bright star that mother loved so much to gaze at was just over the top of yonder tall pine on the mountain, as Hurry got into the canoe; and when you landed him on the point, near the east bay, it wasn't more than the length of Judith's handsomest ribbon above it. And how can you know how long I was gone, or how far I went to land Hurry, seeing you were not with us, and the distance was so great, to say nothing of the night?" "Oh, I know when it was, well enough," returned Hetty, positively. "There's more ways than one for counting time and distance. When the mind is engaged, it is better than any clock. Mine is feeble, I know, but it goes true enough in all that touches poor Hurry Harry. Judith will never marry March, Deerslayer." "That's the p'int, Hetty; that's the very p'int I want to come to. I suppose you know that it's natural for young people to have kind feelin's for one another, more especially when one happens to be a youth and t'other a maiden. Now, one of your years and mind, gal, that has neither father nor mother, and who lives in a wilderness frequented by hunters and trappers, needs to be on her guard against evils she little dreams of." "What harm can it be to think well of a fellow creature?" returned Hetty, simply, though the conscious blood was stealing to her cheeks in spite of a spirit so pure that it scarce knew why it prompted the blush. "The Bible tells us to love them who despitefully use us, and why shouldn't we like them that do not?" "Ah, Hetty, the love of the missionaries isn't the sort of likin' I mean. Answer me one thing, child. Do you believe yourself to have mind enough to become a wife and a mother?" "That's not a proper question to ask a young woman, Deerslayer, and I'll not answer it," returned the girl in a reproving manner, much as a parent rebukes a child for an act of indiscretion. "If you have anything to say about Hurry, I'll hear that, but you must not speak evil of him. He is absent, and 'tis unkind to talk evil of the absent." "Your mother has given you so many good lessons, Hetty, that my fears for you are not as great as they were. Nevertheless, a young woman without parents, in your state of mind, and who is not without beauty, must always be in danger in such a lawless region as this. I would say nothin' amiss of Hurry, who in the main is not a bad man for one of his callin', but you ought to know one thing, which it may not be altogether pleasant to tell you, but which must be said. March has a desperate likin' for your sister Judith." "Well, what of that? Everybody admires Judith. She's so handsome, and Hurry has told me again and again how much he wishes to marry her. But that will never come to pass, for Judith don't like Hurry. She likes another, and talks about him in her sleep, though you need not ask me who he is, for all the gold in King George's crown, and all the jewels too, wouldn't tempt me to tell you his name. If sisters can't keep each other's secrets, who can? Sartainly, I do not wish you to tell me, Hetty, nor would it be any advantage to a dyin' man to know. What the tongue says, when the mind's asleep, neither head nor heart is answerable for." "I wish I knew why Judith talks so much in her sleep, about officers, and honest hearts, and false tongues, but I suppose she don't like to tell me, as I'm feeble minded. Isn't it odd, Deerslayer, that Judith don't like Hurry, he who is the bravest looking youth that ever comes upon the lake, and is as handsome as she is herself? Father always said they would be the comeliest couple in the country, though mother didn't fancy March any more than Judith. There's no telling what will happen, they say, until things actually come to pass." "Ahs! me! Well, poor Hetty, 'tis of no great use to talk to them that can't understand you, and so I'll say no more about what I did wish to speak of, though it lay heavy on my mind. Put the paddle in motion again, gal, and we'll push for the shore, for the sun is nearly up, and my furlough is almost out." The canoe now glided ahead, holding its way towards the point where Deerslayer well knew that his enemies expected him, and where he now began to be afraid he might not arrive in season to redeem his plighted faith. Hetty, perceiving his impatience without very clearly comprehending its cause, however, seconded his efforts in a way that soon rendered their timely return no longer a matter of doubt. Then, and then only, did the young man suffer his exertions to flag, and Hetty began again to prattle in her simple, confiding manner, though nothing farther was uttered that it may be thought necessary to relate. Chapter 26. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 27. Thou hast been busy, Death, this day, and yet but half thy work is done. The gates of hell are thronged, yet twice 10,000 spirits more, who from their warm and healthful tenements fear no divorce, must, ere the sun go down, enter the world of woe. Southey, Roderick, The Last of the Goths, 24, 1-6. One experienced in the signs of the heavens would have seen that the sun wanted but 2 or 3 minutes of the zenith when Deerslayer landed on the point, where the Hurons were now encamped, nearly abreast of the castle. This spot was similar to the one already described, with the exception that the surface of the land was less broken, and less crowded with trees. Owing to these two circumstances, it was all the better suited to the purpose for which it had been selected, the space beneath the branches bearing some resemblance to a densely wooded lawn. Favored by its position and its spring, it had been much resorted to by savages and hunters, and the natural grasses had succeeded their fires, leaving an appearance of sward in places, a very unusual accompaniment of the virgin forest. Nor was the margin of water fringed with bushes, as on so much of its shore, but the eye penetrated the woods immediately on reaching the strand, commanding nearly the whole area of the projection. If it was a point of honor with the Indian warrior to redeem his word, when pledged to return and meet his death at a given hour, so it was a point of characteristic pride to show no womanish impatience, but to reappear as nearly as possible at the appointed moment. It was well not to exceed the grace accorded by the generosity of the enemy, but it was better to meet it to a minute. Something of this dramatic effect mingles with most of the graver usages of the American aborigines, and no doubt, like the prevalence of a similar feeling among people more sophisticated and refined, may be referred to a principle of nature. We all love the wonderful, and when it comes attended by chivalrous self-devotion and a rigid regard to honor, it presents itself to our admiration in a shape doubly attractive. As respects Deerslayer, though he took a pride in showing his white blood, by often deviating from the usages of the red men, he frequently dropped into their customs, and oftener into their feelings, unconsciously to himself, in consequence of having no other arbiters to appeal to than their judgments and tastes. On the present occasion he would have abstained from betraying a feverish haste by a too speedy return, since it would have contained a tacit admission that the time asked for was more than had been wanted. But, on the other hand, had the idea occurred to him, he would have quickened his movements a little, in order to avoid the dramatic appearance of returning at the precise instant set at the utmost limit of his absence. Still, accident had interfered to defeat the last intention, for when the young man put his foot on the point, and advanced with a steady tread towards the group of chiefs that was seated in grave array on a fallen tree, the oldest of their number cast his eye upward, at an opening in the trees, and pointed out to his companions the startling fact that the sun was just entering a space that was known to mark the zenith. A common, but low exclamation of surprise and admiration escaped every mouth, and the grim warriors looked at each other, some with envy and disappointment, some with astonishment at the precise accuracy of their victim, and others with a more generous and liberal feeling. The American Indian always deemed his moral victories the noblest, prizing the groans and yielding of his victim under torture more than the trophy of his scalp, and the trophy itself more than his life. To slay and not to bring off the proof of victory, indeed, was scarcely deemed honorable. Even these rude and fierce tenants of the forest, like their more nurtured brethren of the court and the camp, having set up for themselves imaginary and arbitrary points of honor, to supplant the conclusions of the right and the decisions of reason. The Hurons had been divided in their opinions concerning the probability of their captive's return. Most among them, indeed, had not expected it possible for a pale face to come back voluntarily, and meet the known penalties of an Indian torture. But a few of the seniors expected better things from one who had already shown himself so singularly cool, brave, and upright. The party had come to its decision, however, less in the expectation of finding the pledge redeemed, than in the hope of disgracing the Delawares by casting into their teeth the delinquency of one bred in their villages. They would have greatly preferred that Chingachgook should be their prisoner, and prove the traitor, but the pale-faced scion of the hated stock was no bad substitute for their purposes, failing in their designs against the ancient stem. With a view to render their triumph as signal as possible in the event of the hour's passing without the reappearance of the hunter, all the warriors and scouts of the party had been called in, and the whole band, men, women, and children, was now assembled at this single point, to be a witness of the expected scene. As the castle was in plain view, and by no means distant, it was easily watched by daylight, and it being thought that its inmates were now limited to Hurry, the Delaware, and the two girls, no apprehensions were felt of their being able to escape unseen. A large raft, having a breastwork of logs, had been prepared, and was in actual readiness to be used against either ark or castle as occasion might require, so soon as the fate of Deerslayer was determined, the seniors of the party having come to the opinion that it was getting to be hazardous to delay their departure for Canada beyond the coming night. In short, the band waited merely to dispose of this single affair, ere it brought matters with those in the castle to a crisis, and prepared to commence its retreat towards the distant waters of Ontario. It was an imposing scene into which Deerslayer now found himself advancing. All the older warriors were seated on the trunk of the fallen tree, waiting his approach with grave decorum. On the right stood the young men, armed, while the left was occupied by the women and children. In the centre was an open space of considerable extent, always canopied by trees, but from which the underbrush, dead wood, and other obstacles had been carefully removed. The more open area had probably been much used by former parties, for this was the place where the appearance of a sward was the most decided. The arches of the woods, even at high noon, cast their sombre shadows on the spot, which the brilliant rays of the sun that struggled through the leaves contributed to mellow, and if such an expression can be used, to illuminate. It was probably from a similar scene that the mind of man first got its idea of the effects of Gothic tracery and churchly hues, this temple of nature producing some such effect, so far as light and shadow were concerned, as the well-known offspring of human invention. As was not unusual among the tribes and wandering bands of the aborigines, two chiefs shared, in nearly equal degrees, the principal and primitive authority that was wielded over these children of the forest. There were several who might claim the distinction of being chief men, but the two in question were so much superior to all the rest in influence, that, when they agreed, no one disputed their mandates, and when they were divided the band hesitated, like men who had lost their governing principle of action. It was also in conformity with practice, perhaps we might add in conformity with nature, that one of the chiefs was indebted to his mind for his influence, whereas the other owed his distinction altogether to qualities that were physical. One was a senior, well known for eloquence in debate, wisdom in council, and prudence in measures, while his great competitor, if not his rival, was a brave distinguished in war, notorious for ferocity, and remarkable, in the way of intellect, for nothing but the cunning and expedients of the warpath. The first was Rivenoak, who has already been introduced to the reader, while the last was called Le Panther, in the language of the Canadas, or the Panther, to resort to the vernacular of the English colonies. The appellation of the fighting chief was supposed to indicate the qualities of the warrior, agreeably to the practice of the red man's nomenclature, ferocity, cunning, and treachery being perhaps the distinctive features of his character. The title had been received from the French, and was prized so much the more from that circumstance, the Indian submitting profoundly to the greater intelligence of his pale-face allies, in most things of this nature. How well the sobriquet was merited will be seen in the sequel. Rivenoak and the Panther sat side by side, awaiting the approach of their prisoner, as Deerslayer put his moccasined foot on the strand, nor did either move, or utter a syllable until the young man had advanced into the centre of the area, and proclaimed his presence with his voice. This was done firmly, though in the simple manner that marked the character of the individual. "Here I am, Mingoes," he said in the dialect of the Delawares, a language that most present understood. "Here I am, and there is the sun. One is not more true to the laws of nature than the other has proved true to his word. I am your prisoner. Do with me what you please. My business with man and 'arth is settled. Nothing remains now but to meet the white man's God, according to a white man's duties and gifts." A murmur of approbation escaped even the women at this address, and for an instant there was a strong and pretty general desire to adopt into the tribe one who owned so brave a spirit. Still there were dissenters from this wish, among the principal of whom might be classed the Panther, and his sister Le Sumach, so called from the number of her children, who was the widow of Le Loup Cervier, now known to have fallen by the hand of the captive. Native ferocity held one in subjection, while the corroding passion of revenge prevented the other from emitting any gentler feeling at the moment. Not so with Rivenoak. This chief arose, stretched his arm before him in a gesture of courtesy, and paid his compliments with an ease and dignity that a prince might have envied. As, in that band, his wisdom and eloquence were confessedly without rivals, he knew that on himself would properly fall the duty of first replying to the speech of the pale-face. "Pale-face, you are honest," said the Huron orator. "My people are happy in having captured a man, and not a skulking fox. We now know you. We shall treat you like a brave. If you have slain one of our warriors, and helped to kill others, you have a life of your own ready to give away in return. Some of my young men thought that the blood of a pale-face was too thin, that it would refuse to run under the Huron knife. You will show them it is not so. Your heart is stout, as well as your body. It is a pleasure to make such a prisoner. Should my warriors say that the death of Le Loup Cervier ought not to be forgotten, and that he cannot travel towards the land of spirits alone, that his enemy must be sent to overtake him, they will remember that he fell by the hand of a brave, and send you after him with such signs of our friendship as shall not make him ashamed to keep your company. I have spoken. You know what I have said." "True enough, Mingo, all true as the gospel," returned the simple-minded hunter. "You have spoken, and I do know not only what you have said, but, what is still more important, what you mean. I dare to say your warrior the Lynx was a stout-hearted brave, and worthy of your friendship and respect, but I do not feel unworthy to keep his company, without any passport from your hands. Nevertheless, here I am, ready to receive your judgment from your counsel, if, indeed, the matter was not detarmined among you afore I got back." "My old men would not sit in council over a pale-face until they saw him among them," answered Rivenoak, looking around him a little ironically. "They said it would be like sitting in council over the winds. They go where they will, and come back as they see fit, and not otherwise. There was one voice that spoke in your favor, Deerslayer, but it was alone, like the song of the wren whose mate has been struck by the hawk. I thank that voice, whosever it may have been, Mingo, and will say it was as true a voice as the rest were lying voices. A furlough is as binding on a pale-face, if he be honest, as it is on a red-skin, and was it not so, I would never bring disgrace on the Delawares, among whom I may be said to have received my education. But words are useless, and lead to braggin' feelin's. Here I am. Act your will on me." Rivenoak made a sign of acquiescence, and then a short conference was privately held among the chiefs. As soon as the latter ended, 3 or 4 young men fell back from among the armed group, and disappeared. Then it was signified to the prisoner that he was at liberty to go at large on the point, until a council was held concerning his fate. There was more of seeming than of real confidence, however, in this apparent liberality, inasmuch as the young men mentioned already formed a line of sentinels across the breadth of the point, inland, and escape from any other part was out of the question. Even the canoe was removed beyond this line of sentinels, to a spot where it was considered safe from any sudden attempt. These precautions did not proceed from a failure of confidence, but from the circumstance that the prisoner had now complied with all the required conditions of his parole, and it would have been considered a commendable and honorable exploit to escape from his foes. So nice, indeed, were the distinctions drawn by the savages in cases of this nature, that they often gave their victims a chance to evade the torture, deeming it as creditable to the captors to overtake, or to outwit a fugitive, when his exertions were supposed to be quickened by the extreme jeopardy of his situation, as it was for him to get clear from so much extraordinary vigilance. Nor was Deerslayer unconscious of, or forgetful of, his rights and of his opportunities. Could he now have seen any probable opening for an escape, the attempt would not have been delayed a minute. But the case seemed desperate. He was aware of the line of sentinels, and felt the difficulty of breaking through it, unharmed. The lake offered no advantages, as the canoe would have given his foes the greatest facilities for overtaking him. Else would he have found it no difficult task to swim as far as the castle. As he walked about the point, he even examined the spot to ascertain if it offered no place of concealment, but its openness, its size, and the 100 watchful glances that were turned towards him, even while those who made them affected not to see him, prevented any such expedient from succeeding. The dread and disgrace of failure had no influence on Deerslayer, who deemed it even a point of honor to reason and feel like a white man, rather than as an Indian, and who felt it a sort of duty to do all he could, that did not involve a dereliction from principle, in order to save his life. Still he hesitated about making the effort, for he also felt that he ought to see the chance of success before he committed himself. In the meantime, the business of the camp appeared to proceed in its regular train. The chiefs consulted apart, admitting no one but the Sumach to their councils, for she, the widow of the fallen warrior, had an exclusive right to be heard on such an occasion. The young men strolled about in indolent listlessness, awaiting the result with Indian patience, while the females prepared the feast that was to celebrate the termination of the affair, whether it proved fortunate or otherwise for our hero. No one betrayed feeling, and an indifferent observer, beyond the extreme watchfulness of the sentinels, would have detected no extraordinary movement or sensation to denote the real state of things. 2 or 3 old women put their heads together, and it appeared unfavorably to the prospects of Deerslayer by their scowling looks and angry gestures. But a group of Indian girls were evidently animated by a different impulse, as was apparent by stolen glances that expressed pity and regret. In this condition of the camp, an hour soon glided away. Suspense is perhaps the feeling of all others that is most difficult to be supported. When Deerslayer landed, he fully expected in the course of a few minutes to undergo the tortures of an Indian revenge, and he was prepared to meet his fate manfully. But the delay proved far more trying than the nearer approach of suffering, and the intended victim began seriously to meditate some desperate effort at escape, as it might be from sheer anxiety to terminate the scene, when he was suddenly summoned to appear once more in front of his judges, who had already arranged the band in its former order, in readiness to receive him. "Killer of the Deer," commenced Rivenoak, as soon as his captive stood before him, "my aged men have listened to wise words. They are ready to speak. You are a man whose fathers came from beyond the rising sun. We are children of the setting sun. We turn our faces toward the great sweet lakes, when we look towards our villages. It may be a wide country and full of riches towards the morning, but it is very pleasant towards the evening. We love most to look in that direction. When we gaze at the east, we feel afraid. Canoe after canoe bringing more and more of your people in the track of the sun, as if their land was so full as to run over. The red men are few already. They have need of help. One of our best lodges has lately been emptied by the death of its master. It will be a long time before his son can grow enough to sit in his place. There is his widow. She will want venison to feed her and her children, for her sons are yet like the young of the robin, before they quit the nest. By your hand has this great calamity befallen her. She has 2 duties, one to le Loup Cervier, and one to his children. Scalp for scalp, life for life, blood for blood, is one law. To feed her young, another. We know you, Killer of the Deer. You are honest. When you say a thing, it is so. You have but one tongue, and that is not forked like a snake's. Your head is never hid in the grass. All can see it. What you say, that will you do. You are just. When you have done wrong, it is your wish to do right again, as soon as you can. Here is the Sumach. She is alone in her wigwam, with children crying around her for food. Yonder is a rifle. It is loaded and ready to be fired. Take the gun, go forth and shoot a deer. Bring the venison and lay it before the widow of le Loup Cervier. Feed her children. Call yourself her husband. After which, your heart will no longer be Delaware, but Huron. Le Sumach's ears will not hear the cries of her children. My people will count the proper number of warriors." "I feared this, Rivenoak," answered Deerslayer, when the other had ceased speaking. "Yes, I did dread that it would come to this. Howsever, the truth is soon told, and that will put an end to all expectations on this head. Mingo, I'm white and Christian born. 'Twould ill become me to take a wife, under red skin forms, from among heathen. That which I wouldn't do in peaceable times, and under a bright sun, still less would I do behind clouds, in order to save my life. I may never marry. Most likely Providence, in putting me up here in the woods, has intended I should live single, and without a lodge of my own. But should such a thing come to pass, none but a woman of my own color and gifts shall darken the door of my wigwam. As for feeding the young of your dead warrior, I would do that cheerfully, could it be done without discredit. But it cannot, seeing that I can never live in a Huron village. Your own young men must find the Sumach in venison, and the next time she marries, let her take a husband whose legs are not long enough to overrun territory that don't belong to him. We fought a fair battle, and he fell. In this there is nothin' but what a brave expects, and should be ready to meet. As for getting a Mingo heart, as well might you expect to see gray hairs on a boy, or the blackberry growing on the pine. No, no, Huron, my gifts are white so far as wives are concerned. It is Delaware in all things touchin' Injins." These words were scarcely out of the mouth of Deerslayer, before a common murmur betrayed the dissatisfaction with which they had been heard. The aged women, in particular, were loud in their expressions of disgust, and the gentle Sumach herself, a woman quite old enough to be our hero's mother, was not the least pacific in her denunciations. But all the other manifestations of disappointment and discontent were thrown into the background, by the fierce resentment of the Panther. This grim chief had thought it a degradation to permit his sister to become the wife of a pale face of the Yengeese at all, and had only given a reluctant consent to the arrangement, one by no means unusual among the Indians, however, at the earnest solicitations of the bereaved widow, and it goaded him to the quick to find his condescension slighted, the honor he had with so much regret been persuaded to accord, condemned. The animal from which he got his name does not glare on his intended prey with more frightful ferocity than his eyes gleamed on the captive, nor was his arm backward in seconding the fierce resentment that almost consumed his breast. "Dog of the pale faces!" he exclaimed in Iroquois, "go yell among the curs of your own evil hunting grounds." The denunciation was accompanied by an appropriate action. Even while speaking his arm was lifted, and the tomahawk hurled. Luckily the loud tones of the speaker had drawn the eye of Deerslayer towards him, else would that moment have probably closed his career. So great was the dexterity with which this dangerous weapon was thrown, and so deadly the intent, that it would have riven the skull of the prisoner, had he not stretched forth an arm, and caught the handle in one of its turns with a readiness quite as remarkable as the skill with which the missile had been hurled. The projectile force was so great, notwithstanding, that when Deerslayer's arm was arrested, his hand was raised above and behind his own head, and in the very attitude necessary to return the attack. It is not certain whether the circumstance of finding himself unexpectedly in this menacing posture and armed tempted the young man to retaliate, or whether sudden resentment overcame his forbearance and prudence. His eye kindled, however, and a small red spot appeared on each cheek, while he cast all his energy into the effort of his arm, and threw back the weapon at his assailant. The unexpectedness of this blow contributed to its success, the Panther neither raising an arm, nor bending his head to avoid it. The keen little axe struck the victim in a perpendicular line with the nose, directly between the eyes, literally braining him on the spot. Sallying forward, as the serpent darts at its enemy even while receiving its own death wound, this man of powerful frame fell his length into the open area formed by the circle, quivering in death. A common rush to his relief left the captive, in a single instant, quite without the crowd, and, willing to make one desperate effort for life, he bounded off with the activity of a deer. There was but a breathless instant, when the whole band, old and young, women and children, abandoning the lifeless body of the panther where it lay, raised the yell of alarm, and followed in pursuit. Sudden as had been the event which induced Deerslayer to make this desperate trial of speed, his mind was not wholly unprepared for the fearful emergency. In the course of the past hour, he had pondered well on the chances of such an experiment, and had shrewdly calculated all the details of success and failure. At the first leap, therefore, his body was completely under the direction of an intelligence that turned all its efforts to the best account, and prevented everything like hesitation or indecision at the important instant of the start. To this alone he was indebted for the first great advantage, that of getting through the line of sentinels unharmed. The manner in which this was done, though sufficiently simple, merits a description. Although the shores of the point were not fringed with bushes, as was the case with most of the others on the lake, it was owing altogether to the circumstance that the spot had been so much used by hunters and fishermen. This fringe commenced on what might be termed the mainland, and was as dense as usual, extending in long lines both north and south. In the latter direction, then, Deerslayer held his way, and as the sentinels were a little without the commencement of this thicket, before the alarm was clearly communicated to them the fugitive had gained its cover. To run among the bushes, however, was out of the question, and Deerslayer held his way, for some 40 or 50 yards, in the water, which was barely knee deep, offering as great an obstacle to the speed of his pursuers as it did to his own. As soon as a favorable spot presented, he darted through the line of bushes and issued into the open woods. Several rifles were discharged at Deerslayer while in the water, and more followed as he came out into the comparative exposure of the clear forest. But the direction of his line of flight, which partially crossed that of the fire, the haste with which the weapons had been aimed, and the general confusion that prevailed in the camp, prevented any harm from being done. Bullets whistled past him, and many cut twigs from the branches at his side, but not one touched even his dress. The delay caused by these fruitless attempts was of great service to the fugitive, who had gained more than 100 yards on even the leading men of the Hurons, ere something like concert and order had entered into the chase. To think of following with rifles in hand was out of the question, and after emptying their pieces in vague hopes of wounding their captive, the best runners of the Indians threw them aside, calling out to the women and boys to recover and load them, again, as soon as possible. Deerslayer knew too well the desperate nature of the struggle in which he was engaged to lose one of the precious moments. He also knew that his only hope was to run in a straight line, for as soon as he began to turn, or double, the greater number of his pursuers would put escape out of the question. He held his way, therefore, in a diagonal direction up the acclivity, which was neither very high nor very steep in this part of the mountain, but which was sufficiently toilsome for one contending for life to render it painfully oppressive. There, however, he slackened his speed to recover breath, proceeding even at a quick walk or a slow trot, along the more difficult parts of the way. The Hurons were whooping and leaping behind him, but this he disregarded, well knowing they must overcome the difficulties he had surmounted ere they could reach the elevation to which he had attained. The summit of the first hill was now quite near him, and he saw by the formation of the land that a deep glen intervened before the base of a second hill could be reached. Walking deliberately to the summit, he glanced eagerly about him, in every direction, in quest of a cover. None offered in the ground, but a fallen tree lay near him, and desperate circumstances required desperate remedies. This tree lay in a line parallel to the glen, at the brow of the hill. To leap on it, and then to force his person as close as possible under its lower side, took but a moment. Previously to disappearing from his pursuers, however, Deerslayer stood on the height and gave a cry of triumph, as if exulting at the sight of the descent that lay before him. In the next instant he was stretched beneath the tree. No sooner was this expedient adopted, than the young man ascertained how desperate had been his own efforts, by the violence of the pulsations in his frame. He could hear his heart beat, and his breathing was like the action of a bellows, in quick motion. Breath was gained, however, and the heart soon ceased to throb as if about to break through its confinement. The footsteps of those who toiled up the opposite side of the acclivity were now audible, and presently voices and treads announced the arrival of the pursuers. The foremost shouted as they reached the height, then, fearful that their enemy would escape under favor of the descent, each leaped upon the fallen tree, and plunged into the ravine, trusting to get a sight of the pursued ere he reached the bottom. In this manner, Huron followed Huron until Natty began to hope the whole had passed. Others succeeded, however, until quite 40 had leaped over the tree, and then he counted them, as the surest mode of ascertaining how many could be behind. Presently all were in the bottom of the glen, quite 100 feet below him, and some had even ascended part of the opposite hill, when it became evident an inquiry was making as to the direction he had taken. This was the critical moment, and one of nerves less steady, or of a training that had been neglected, would have seized it to rise and fly. Not so with Deerslayer. He still lay quiet, watching with jealous vigilance every movement below, and fast regaining his breath. The Hurons now resembled a pack of hounds at fault. Little was said, but each man ran about, examining the dead leaves as the hound hunts for the lost scent. The great number of moccasins that had passed made the examination difficult, though the in toe of an Indian was easily to be distinguished from the freer and wider step of a white man. Believing that no more pursuers remained behind, and hoping to steal away unseen, Deerslayer suddenly threw himself over the tree, and fell on the upper side. This achievement appeared to be effected successfully, and hope beat high in the bosom of the fugitive. Rising to his hands and feet, after a moment lost in listening to the sounds in the glen, in order to ascertain if he had been seen, the young man next scrambled to the top of the hill, a distance of only 10 yards, in the expectation of getting its brow between him and his pursuers, and himself so far under cover. Even this was effected, and he rose to his feet, walking swiftly, but steadily along the summit, in a direction opposite to that in which he had first fled. The nature of the calls in the glen, however, soon made him uneasy, and he sprang upon the summit again, in order to reconnoitre. No sooner did he reach the height than he was seen, and the chase renewed. As it was better footing on the level ground, Deerslayer now avoided the side hill, holding his flight along the ridge, while the Hurons, judging from the general formation of the land, saw that the ridge would soon melt into the hollow, and kept to the latter, as the easiest mode of heading the fugitive. A few, at the same time, turned south, with a view to prevent his escaping in that direction, while some crossed his trail towards the water, in order to prevent his retreat by the lake, running southerly. The situation of Deerslayer was now more critical than it ever had been. He was virtually surrounded on 3 sides, having the lake on the 4th. But he had pondered well on all the chances, and took his measures with coolness, even while at the top of his speed. As is generally the case with the vigorous bordermen, he could outrun any single Indian among his pursuers, who were principally formidable to him on account of their numbers, and the advantages they possessed in position, and he would not have hesitated to break off in a straight line at any spot, could he have got the whole band again fairly behind him. But no such chance did, or indeed could now offer, and when he found that he was descending towards the glen, by the melting away of the ridge, he turned short at right angles to his previous course, and went down the declivity with tremendous velocity, holding his way towards the shore. Some of his pursuers came panting up the hill in direct chase, while most still kept on the ravine, intending to head him at its termination. Deerslayer had now a different, though a desperate project in view. Abandoning all thoughts of escape by the woods, he made the best of his way towards the canoe. He knew where it lay. Could it be reached, he had only to run the gauntlet of a few rifles, and success would be certain. None of the warriors had kept their weapons, which would have retarded their speed, and the risk would come either from the uncertain hands of the women, or from those of some well-grown boy, though most of the latter were already out in hot pursuit. Everything seemed propitious to the execution of this plan, and the course being a continued descent, the young man went over the ground at a rate that promised a speedy termination to his toil. As Deerslayer approached the point, several women and children were passed, but, though the former endeavored to cast dried branches between his legs, the terror inspired by his bold retaliation on the redoubted panther was so great that none dared come near enough seriously to molest him. He went by all triumphantly and reached the fringe of bushes. Plunging through these, our hero found himself once more in the lake, and within 50 feet of the canoe. Here he ceased to run, for he well understood that his breath was now all important to him. He even stooped, as he advanced, and cooled his parched mouth by scooping water up in his hand to drink. Still the moments pressed, and he soon stood at the side of the canoe. The first glance told him that the paddles had been removed. This was a sore disappointment, after all his efforts, and for a single moment he thought of turning and of facing his foes by walking with dignity into the centre of the camp again. But an infernal yell, such as the American savage alone can raise, proclaimed the quick approach of the nearest of his pursuers, and the instinct of life triumphed. Preparing himself duly, and giving a right direction to its bows, he ran off into the water, bearing the canoe before him, threw all his strength and skill into a last effort, and cast himself forward so as to fall into the bottom of the light craft without materially impeding its way. Here he remained on his back, both to regain his breath and to cover his person from the deadly rifle. The lightness, which was such an advantage in paddling the canoe, now operated unfavorably. The material was so like a feather, that the boat had no momentum, else would the impulse in that smooth and placid sheet have impelled it to a distance from the shore that would have rendered paddling with the hands safe. Could such a point once be reached, Deerslayer thought he might get far enough out to attract the attention of Chingachgook and Judith, who would not fail to come to his relief with other canoes, a circumstance that promised everything. As the young man lay in the bottom of the canoe, he watched its movements by studying the tops of the trees in the mountain side, and judged of his distance by the time and the motions. Voices on the shore were now numerous, and he heard something said about manning the raft, which, fortunately for the fugitive, lay at a considerable distance on the other side of the point. Perhaps the situation of Deerslayer had not been more critical that day than it was at this moment. It certainly had not been one half as tantalizing. He lay perfectly quiet for 2 or 3 minutes, trusting to the single sense of hearing, confident that the noise in the lake would reach his ears, did any one venture to approach by swimming. Once or twice he fancied that the element was stirred by the cautious movement of an arm, and then he perceived it was the wash of the water on the pebbles of the strand. For, in mimicry of the ocean, it is seldom that those little lakes are so totally tranquil as not to possess a slight heaving and settling on their shores. Suddenly all the voices ceased, and a death-like stillness pervaded the spot, a quietness as profound as if all lay in the repose of inanimate life. By this time the canoe had drifted so far as to render nothing visible to Deerslayer, as he lay on his back, except the blue void of space, and a few of those brighter rays that proceed from the effulgence of the sun, marking his proximity. It was not possible to endure this uncertainty long. The young man well knew that the profound stillness foreboded evil, the savages never being so silent as when about to strike a blow, resembling the stealthy foot of the panther ere he takes his leap. He took out a knife, and was about to cut a hole through the bark, in order to get a view of the shore, when he paused from a dread of being seen in the operation, which would direct the enemy where to aim their bullets. At this instant a rifle was fired, and the ball pierced both sides of the canoe, within 18 inches of the spot where his head lay. This was close work, but our hero had too lately gone through that which was closer to be appalled. He lay still half a minute longer, and then he saw the summit of an oak coming slowly within his narrow horizon. Unable to account for this change, Deerslayer could restrain his impatience no longer. Hitching his body along, with the utmost caution, he got his eye at the bullet hole, and fortunately commanded a very tolerable view of the point. The canoe, by one of those imperceptible impulses that so long decide the fate of men as well as the course of things, had inclined southerly, and was slowly drifting down the lake. It was lucky that Deerslayer had given it a shove sufficiently vigorous to send it past the end of the point, ere it took this inclination, or it must have gone ashore again. As it was, it drifted so near it as to bring the tops of 2 or 3 trees within the range of the young man's view, as has been mentioned, and indeed to come in quite as close proximity with the extremity of the point as was at all safe. The distance could not much have exceeded 100 feet, though fortunately a light current of air from the southwest began to set it slowly off shore. Deerslayer now felt the urgent necessity of resorting to some expedient to get farther from his foes, and if possible to apprise his friends of his situation. The distance rendered the last difficult, while the proximity to the point rendered the first indispensable. As was usual in such craft, a large, round, smooth stone was in each end of the canoe, for the double purpose of seats and ballast. One of these was within reach of his feet, This stone he contrived to get so far between his legs as to reach it with his hands, and then he managed to roll it to the side of its fellow in the bows, where the two served to keep the trim of the light boat, while he worked his own body as far aft as possible. Before quitting the shore, and as soon as he perceived that the paddles were gone, Deerslayer had thrown a bit of dead branch into the canoe, and this was within reach of his arm. Removing the cap he wore, he put it on the end of this stick, and just let it appear over the edge of the canoe, as far as possible from his own person. This ruse was scarcely adopted before the young man had a proof of how much he had underrated the intelligence of his enemies. In contempt of an artifice so shallow and commonplace, a bullet was fired directly through another part of the canoe, which actually raised his skin. He dropped the cap, and instantly raised it immediately over his head, as a safeguard. It would seem that this second artifice was unseen, or, what was more probable, the Hurons, feeling certain of recovering their captive, wished to take him alive. Deerslayer lay passive a few minutes longer, his eye at the bullet hole, however, and much did he rejoice at seeing that he was drifting, gradually, farther and farther from the shore. When he looked upward, the tree tops had disappeared, but he soon found that the canoe was slowly turning, so as to prevent his getting a view of anything at his peephole, but of the two extremities of the lake. He now bethought him of the stick, which was crooked and offered some facilities for rowing without the necessity of rising. The experiment succeeded on trial better even than he had hoped, though his great embarrassment was to keep the canoe straight. That his present maneuver was seen, soon became apparent by the clamor on the shore, and a bullet entering the stern of the canoe traversed its length, whistling between the arms of our hero, and passed out at the head. This satisfied the fugitive that he was getting away with tolerable speed, and induced him to increase his efforts. He was making a stronger push than common, when another messenger from the point broke the stick outboard, and at once deprived him of his oar. As the sound of voices seemed to grow more and more distant, however, Deerslayer determined to leave all to the drift, until he believed himself beyond the reach of bullets. This was nervous work, but it was the wisest of all the expedients that offered, and the young man was encouraged to persevere in it by the circumstance that he felt his face fanned by the air, a proof that there was a little more wind. Chapter 27. Recording by Bill Borst.